Damien Voss smiled when he signed the paper. Not a polite smile. Not even a satisfied one. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting a long time to watch something burn and had finally struck the match himself. He set the pen down slowly, slid the document across the desk, and looked at his cousin Caleb the way a butcher looks at livestock. Not with hatred, with patience, the kind that had been building for years, quiet and invisible, right behind the face of a man everyone trusted. "You don't have a choice anymore," Damien said. "The bank won't wait. The land won't wait. And frankly, Caleb, neither will I." Caleb's hand tightened on the edge of the desk. His leg ached. It always ached. But what hurt worse in that moment was knowing that the man sitting across from him, the man who had eaten at his table, ridden his land, called him, family, had been planning this for longer than either of them had said out loud. Damien was not trying to save the ranch. He was trying to bury it. And he was about to succeed. If this story already has you wondering what you would do if everything you'd built was being stolen by the one person you trusted most, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and follow Elena and Caleb's story all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what comes next. And while you're here, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Elena Whitmore had not planned on arriving in Black Hollow in a torn dress with 42 cents in her coat pocket and a bruise along her jaw that she kept trying to pretend wasn't there. She hadn't planned on a lot of things. She hadn't planned on her husband dying 3 months into their marriage, leaving behind debts she didn't know existed, and a family that treated his death like the moment they'd been waiting for. His brothers had arrived at the house before the funeral. Arrangements were even finished. They moved through the rooms with the efficiency of men who had rehearsed this, pulling open drawers, stacking boxes, carrying out furniture, while she stood in the kitchen, trying to understand what was happening. "You have no legal claim," the older brother Gerald had told her, not unkindly, which was almost worse than if he'd been cruel. "Thomas's estate transfers to the family. You were married less than a season. There's nothing here for you," she had tried to argue. She had a letter. She had witnesses who knew Thomas had intended to update his will. But Gerald had a lawyer, and the lawyer had paperwork, and the paperwork had already been filed. And by the time Elena understood the shape of what was being done to her, the house was already half emptied. She left with what she came with. Less, actually. The road to Black Hollow took her 3 days by wagon, hitching rides where she could, walking when she couldn't. She had a single name in her pocket, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who ran a boarding house near the mill, and the name was given to her by a woman she'd met at a rest stop who said Black Hollow was the kind of place where a person could start over if they were willing to work. Elena was willing to work. She was willing to do almost anything. What she was not prepared for was the notice board outside the post office. It was the usual kind wool for trade, a missing dog, someone selling a wagon wheel, and then, near the bottom, a handwritten card tucked slightly behind a land auction notice, as though whoever posted it hadn't been entirely sure they wanted it seen. Rancher seeks capable woman for domestic partnership. Full arrangement. No romantic expectations. Inquire at the Voss property, North Road, 3 miles past the mill. Elena read it twice. She told herself she wasn't going to inquire. She inquired the next morning. The Voss property was exactly what you would expect from a ranch that had once been powerful and was no longer sure of itself. The fences were straight enough, but you could see where posts had been replaced in a hurry, the wood not quite matching. The main house was large, genuinely large, the kind of structure that told you money had been spent on it once, but the porch sagged on the left side, and 2 of the windows had been boarded over from the inside. A hand who looked about 16 years old met her at the gate and told her to wait. She waited 20 minutes in the cold before Caleb Voss appeared. She had expected someone older. She had expected someone who looked defeated because the notice had carried the particular exhaustion of a man writing something he didn't want to write. What she got was a man about 40, broad across the shoulders with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something harder than bone. He walked with a cane, his left leg moving stiffly, the heel not quite landing right, and he watched her approach, the way you watch a storm coming in from the west, not afraid of it, but calculating what it might cost. "You're the one who asked about the arrangement," he said. It wasn't a question, Elena Whitmore. He looked her over in the way people do when they're trying to decide something practical. Not rude, just direct in a way she wasn't entirely used to. You have references? I have a letter from my previous employer in Denton, and I can tell you what I know and what I don't, which I figure is more useful than a reference from a man who might not say the truth. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, and maybe not ever, but something that looked like faint interest. What do you know? He asked. Livestock management. Basic accounts. I can read a contract and I know when numbers don't add up. I can cook well enough that no one has complained. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not afraid of hard weather. I don't know this land yet. I don't know your people or your routines. I don't know what kind of trouble this ranch is in, though I can see it's in some kind. She paused. And I don't know you. He was quiet for a moment. That last part goes both ways, he said finally. The arrangement he offered was blunt and unromantic, which Elena appreciated more than she expected to. He needed someone to manage the household, assist with the accounts, and maintain the appearance of a stable operation for the bank's sake. His previous marriage, he said this the way someone states a weather fact, flatly. No inflection had ended when his ex-wife decided she hadn't signed up to be a rancher's nurse. The ranch had been struggling since his accident. Staff had left. Pliers were becoming difficult, and the bank had begun making noises that Caleb said he didn't want to explain in detail yet. In exchange, she would have a room, meals, and a wage that was fair if not generous. You'd be a wife on paper, he said, for the bank, for the town. People will talk less if there's a woman in the house. They'll take the operation more seriously. Elena looked at him steadily. And if I decide after a month that this isn't what I want, then you leave and I pay you for the month. And if you decide after a month that I'm not what you need, same answer. She thought about Ruth Calloway's boarding house, which had turned out to be full, and about her 42 cents, and about the bruise along her jaw that was finally starting to fade. All right, she said. He nodded once. That settled something he hadn't been entirely sure would be settled. The first 2 weeks were not comfortable. That was the honest word for it. Not hostile, not miserable, just not comfortable. Caleb Voss ran his household the way a man runs something he no longer trusts himself to run well, at arm's length, with clear rules and very little conversation that wasn't strictly necessary. He ate at the far end of the table. He retired early. When Elena asked about the household accounts on her 4th day, he handed her a ledger without a word and left the room, before she could ask a follow-up question. She opened the ledger. She read through it twice. Then she sat for a long time with her hands flat on the table, looking at numbers that didn't make sense. The ranch wasn't just struggling. It was being drained. Slowly, methodically, in ways that would look like ordinary bad luck. If you didn't look carefully, but if you looked carefully, a pattern started to emerge. Plier contracts renegotiated at prices no sensible supplier would have accepted. Payments made for services that didn't appear in any of the work records. A land lease that had been quietly altered, sometime in the past 18 months. Someone had been inside these books, and whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. She didn't bring it to Caleb immediately. She needed to be sure. A new woman coming in and accusing someone on the basis of numbers that might have a perfectly ordinary explanation was not a position she wanted to be in. So she spent 4 days going through every record she could find, cross-referencing dates, tracking names. The name that kept appearing always at the edge, always with a reasonable-sounding explanation, always present when something went sideways was Damien Voss. She knew the name. Caleb had mentioned his cousin twice, both times with the particular tone people use for someone they're supposed to trust, and haven't quite decided whether they do. She watched Damien the first time he visited the ranch on her 9th day. He rode in like he owned the place not aggressively, but comfortably, the way you walk through a room you expect to inherit. He was better dressed than Caleb, smoother in his speech, and he greeted Elena with exactly the right amount of warmth, interested but not intrusive, charming but not aggressive. You must be the new Mrs. Voss, he said, extending his hand. Elena, she said, and didn't correct or confirm the title. He smiled. Caleb's lucky to have found someone capable. The ranch needs it, God knows. She smiled back and handed him a cup of coffee and said very little. But she watched. She watched the way his eyes moved through the room, cataloging, assessing, adding things up. She watched the way he talked to Caleb, always slightly too helpful, always steering conversation toward what the ranch needed, toward costs and failures, toward the particular kind of hopelessness that made a man feel like selling was the only sensible option. By the time Damien left that afternoon, Elena had already made two decisions. The first, she was not leaving this ranch after 1 month. The second, she needed to understand exactly how deep this went before she said a single word to Caleb Voss. That night, she found Caleb sitting on the porch in the dark, which she gathered was something he did often because the chair was positioned at an angle that suggested long use, and the wood beneath it was worn smooth. She sat down in the other chair, the one with a broken arm that nobody had fixed, and didn't say anything for a moment. "Your cousin visits a lot," she said finally. "He helps manage some of the business dealings," Caleb said. "Has for a few years. Since before the accident?" Pause. "About when?" She nodded slowly. "He seems very concerned about the ranch." "He is. What does he get out of it?" Another pause, this one longer. "Family," Caleb said, and she could hear in the word both the answer and the doubt underneath it. She didn't push further. She wasn't ready. When she went inside, she made sure the ledger was locked in her room, and she spent 2 hours that night in the lamplight, writing down every name, every date, every number that hadn't sat right in her stomach since she'd first opened that book. She'd been at the ranch 23 days when the first catastrophe hit. The Eastern supply contract, the one that had been providing feed at a rate Caleb had negotiated personally 2 years ago, was abruptly canceled. The supplier sent a letter, formal and apologetic, citing new pricing structures and the inability to continue at the previous agreed terms. Elena read the letter 3 times. Then she rode out to see the supplier herself. She didn't tell Caleb where she was going. She told the young hand, whose name was Pete, that she needed to run an errand and she'd be back before dark. The supplier was a wide, sunburned man named Haskell, who met her at the gate with the cautious politeness of someone who expects trouble. "I received the letter," Elena said. "I wanted to understand the pricing issue." Haskell looked uncomfortable. "It's just business, ma'am." "Things changed." "What changed?" He was quiet. "Mr. I am not here to cause you difficulty. I'm here because the Voss Ranch has been a good customer for a long time, and I'm trying to understand what's happening. If someone approached you, if someone suggested it would be in your interest to end this contract, I'd like to know." Haskell looked at his boots, then at the fence, then, for a moment, at something over her shoulder that wasn't there. "I was told," he said slowly, "that the Voss operation was in serious default, that they'd be unable to pay going forward. I was told this by someone I had no reason not to believe." "Someone named Damien Voss?" The way Haskell's jaw tightened told her everything. She thanked him, turned her horse around, and rode back toward the ranch with a cold, settled feeling in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. She told Caleb that evening. Not everything, but enough. She sat across the table from him and laid out what she'd found in the accounts, the altered numbers, the redirected contracts, the pattern that pointed consistently in one direction. And she told him about Haskell, and she told him what Haskell had said, and she watched Caleb's face do something she hadn't seen it do before. It went very still, not angry still, not surprised still, sad still. The stillness of a man who has heard something he already suspected somewhere underneath everything else and had been hoping wasn't true. "Damien," he said, "just the name." "I'm not certain of everything yet," Elena said. "The numbers, I know." He cut her off gently. "I know." He stood up from the table and walked to the window, and she could see the effort it took him on that leg, the particular way his jaw set against the pain he never talked about, and he stood there for a long time with his back to her, looking at the dark land outside. He was the only one who stayed, Caleb said quietly. After the accident, after Margaret left. Everyone else had something more important to be doing. He paused. Damien stayed. Elena said nothing. "He stayed," Caleb repeated, and all that time. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Elena sat very still and let the room be quiet, because some things needed a moment to land before anyone could decide what to do next. And what she felt in that moment, watching a man confront the shape of a betrayal he'd been living inside of without knowing, was not pity. It was recognition. She knew what it felt like when the person who was supposed to protect you was the one taking everything away. She had 42 cents and a bruise along her jaw to prove it. "We need to be careful about what we do next," she said finally. Caleb turned from the window. His face had settled into something harder now. Something that looked more like the rancher he'd been before the accident started chipping away at him. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. And Elena Whitmore, who had arrived in Black Hollow with nothing and had spent 3 weeks learning the shape of a battle she hadn't known she was walking into, leaned forward and began to talk. Plan Elena laid out that night was not elegant. That was the first thing she said, which Caleb appreciated more than she probably knew, because he'd spent the last 2 years being talked to by people who wrapped bad news in careful language, and the directness of a woman who started a sentence with "this is not going to be clean" was something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. She spread the ledger across the kitchen tables between them and used a pencil to trace the pattern she'd found, not all of it, because there was still more she needed to verify, but enough. Enough to show him the shape of what Damien had been building. The way each individual piece could be explained away on its own. A renegotiated contract, a mispayment, a supplier who decided to change terms. Each one ordinary. Each one taken alone, just the kind of bad luck that happened to ranches that were already struggling. But together they formed something that was not bad luck at all. Together they formed a map. "He's been pushing the ranch toward a specific failure point," Elena said, tapping one column with the eraser end of the pencil. "Not collapse, not total collapse, because that wouldn't serve him. He needs the land to still be valuable when he moves to acquire it. So he's been creating the conditions where you feel like selling is the only rational option, where it feels like your decision." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "How long?" "Based on what I can trace, at least 2 years. Maybe longer before that, but the pattern gets harder to read before then." 2 years. He did the math without meaning to. 2 years ago, he was still recovering from the accident. Still trying to figure out how bad the leg was going to stay. Still watching Margaret pack her things with that particular efficiency that told him she'd been ready to leave for a while. And the accident had just given her the clearest reason. Damien had been there for all of it. "He came out the week after the accident," Caleb said. His voice was flat, which was the only way he could talk about it, without the flatness cracking into something uglier. "Sat with me in the hospital. Said he'd watch the operation while I recovered. Said family looks after family. Elena said nothing, which was the right call. I let him into everything," Caleb said. "The accounts, the supplier relationships, the contracts. I handed him the keys because I could barely get out of bed, and I thought..." He stopped. "I thought he was the one person I could trust." He knew that," Elena said carefully. "He counted on it." Caleb turned and looked at her directly for the first time during the conversation. "You've been here less than a month." "Yes. You figured this out in less than a month." She held his gaze. "I didn't have any reason to trust him." That made it easier to see. He looked at the ledger again. Something moved across his face, not quite anger, not quite shame. Something that lived between the two and was harder to name. "What do we do?" "Nothing yet," she said. "If we move now, he'll know we're onto him, and he'll cover whatever he hasn't covered yet. We need to see the whole picture before we show our hand." She paused. "And we need to be very careful that he doesn't figure out what I'm doing." "He'll be back next week," Caleb said. "He comes every Tuesday." "Good," said Elena. "Then next Tuesday, everything needs to look exactly like it did before." Learning to pretend was not something Elena had expected to add to her list of ranch duties. That was what the next 8 days required. When Damien arrived the following Tuesday, she met him at the door with the same measured warmth she'd offered, the first time not cold, not excessive, just the ordinary courtesy of a woman managing a household. She offered coffee. She asked after his ride. She mentioned, as though it had just occurred to her, that the Eastern supply situation had been a setback, and she watched his face carefully as she said it. He expressed concern beautifully. That was the only word for it. The slight furrow of the brow, the forward lean of a man who genuinely cared, the way he shook his head slowly and said he'd heard about Haskell pulling the contract, and wasn't that a shame? Wasn't that exactly the kind of thing that happened when a ranch's reputation started slipping in the business community? Caleb needs to think seriously about the future. Damien said, stirring his coffee. "I hate to say it, but a man has to be practical. This land is worth something right now. In another year, if things keep sliding, I'm sure it'll work out," Elena said pleasantly. He smiled at her. "You're optimistic. That's good. Caleb needs that. A pause. Just don't let optimism get in the way of good sense." She smiled back and refilled his cup and said nothing at all. After he left, She stood at the window and watched his horse disappear down the north road, and she let herself feel the anger for exactly 30 seconds, the cold, specific anger of a woman who has been underestimated to her face by a man who thought he was being charming, and then she put it somewhere useful and went back to the ledger. Pete, the young hand, turned out to be more valuable than Elena had initially calculated. He was 17, gap-toothed, and had the particular quality of someone who had learned early that being unnoticed was a form of safety. He let out a short, ugly laugh. He'd been at the Voss ranch for 2 years, hired on right around the time of Caleb's accident, which meant he'd watched the whole slow unraveling from the inside without anyone paying him much attention. Elena found him one afternoon, mending a section of fence on the west side, and brought him a water canteen as an excuse to start a conversation. "You've been here a while," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Longer than most of the other hands. They left when the pay got uncertain." He said it matter-of-factly, without complaint. "I stayed because Mr. Voss gave me work when nobody else would." Seemed like the kind of loyalty you don't just walk away from. Elena looked at him for a moment. "What do you see, Pete, working the land every day? What do you notice?" He was quiet, working the wire carefully. "You mean about Mr. Damien?" She kept her expression neutral. "What makes you say that?" He was quiet for another moment. "Then things go wrong after he visits, not right away. But within a week, 2 weeks, something falls through. Something gets canceled. Something costs more than it should. I noticed it about a year ago." He glanced at her sideways. "I didn't think it was my place to say anything." "Whose place did you think it was?" He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. "If I asked you to start keeping track," Elena said quietly, "write down when he visits, what happens after. Anything that seems off, would you do that?" Pete set down the wire tool and looked at her. He had young eyes, but they weren't naive. "Does Mr. Voss know you're asking me this?" "He will." Pick the tool back up. "Then yes, ma'am, I'd do that." Caleb was harder. Not because he resisted what Elena was doing, he didn't. He'd given her access to whatever she needed and asked for daily updates, which she provided. But there was something happening alongside the investigation that was more complicated than the investigation itself, and Elena found herself navigating it carefully because she hadn't expected it and wasn't sure she knew how. The man Caleb Voss had been before the accident was visible sometimes in fragments. The way he spoke to the cattle, low and steady, when he thought no one was listening. The particular authority in his hands when he inspected a fence or assessed the weight of a calf. The way Pete straightened slightly when Caleb was nearby, not out of fear, but out of the instinctive respect a young man develops for someone competent. But then something would catch his leg, or a moment when he needed to ask for help with something he used to do without thinking, and the shutters came down. He'd pull away, go quiet, do whatever he was doing alone, even when it took twice as long and cost him visible pain. He had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of the last 2 years, that needing anything from anyone was a kind of failure. That asking made him less. Elena understood that logic. She'd seen it before. She'd felt something close to it herself, standing in an empty house while Tom's brother carried out the furniture. She also knew it was going to get him killed, metaphorically speaking, if she didn't find a way to work around it. The way she found was practical rather than emotional, because practical worked better with Caleb. Instead of offering help, she started asking questions that required his expertise. She'd bring him a problem something to do with the cattle rotation, a supplier term she didn't understand, or nemectrums that on selection of the accounts that needed his context, and he'd answer because the question was real and the information mattered. Over time, without either of them quite acknowledging what was happening, a working rhythm developed. He knew things she didn't. She knew things he didn't. Between them, the picture was clearer than either could make it alone. It was not a friendship exactly. It was not anything that had a clean name. But it was real in the way that only things built out of necessity tend to be real. And Elena found herself trusting it more than she'd trusted most things that came more easily. The second piece of evidence fell into her hands by accident, the way the important things often do. She had ridden out to check on the northern grazing section. Caleb had mentioned a section of fence that needed assessing, and she'd taken a longer route back because the sky was doing something interesting, and she wasn't ready to go inside yet. The longer route took her past the old Cutter's Creek property, which had been abandoned for years and sat at the edge of Voss land. She almost didn't stop, but her horse did, picking up something, a scent, a sound, and she let it stand while she looked around. And that was when she saw the tracks. Fresh wagon tracks in the mud beside the creek, too recent for yesterday's weather. And beside them, boot prints from multiple people. Elena dismounted and followed the tracks a short distance into the brush. The abandoned property's old barn came into view, and through the gaps in the boards, she could see shapes in the dim interior. The shapes of cattle, not wild cattle, cattle with brands. She didn't go close enough to read the brands. She didn't need to. She memorized the location of the wagon tracks, the angle of the boot prints, the way the barn door had been recently reinforced with new wood that didn't match the old. Then she mounted her horse and rode back to the ranch at a pace that she kept deliberately ordinary in case anyone was watching the road. She told Caleb that night. He went very still, in the way she was beginning to recognize the stillness before he made a decision. Cattle, he said. Several head. I couldn't read the brands without getting closer, and I didn't want to risk being seen. The brands matter, he said. If those are brands from neighboring ranches, then someone has been running a theft operation out of an abandoned property on the edge of your land, she said. And if it's ever discovered, whose land does that operation sit closest to? He looked at her. Yours, she said quietly. They rode out together before dawn. That was not a simple decision. Caleb's was managed worse in the cold mornings, and he'd learned to manage the ranch that fact without ever admitting to it, adjusting his work to the times of day when the pain was more manageable. Riding before sunrise in October was not on that list. He didn't say any of that. He saddled his horse and was ready at the gate when Elena came out, and she said nothing about it either, and they rode out in the gray pre-dawn quiet, with Pete trailing behind them, because Pete had asked to come, and Caleb had looked at him for a moment and said yes. The barn was as Elena had left it. The wagon tracks were still visible. Cattle were still inside. Caleb dismounted and approached the barn with the cane in his left hand and a steadiness in his movements that had nothing to do with the leg. He pulled the barn door open and stood in the growing light and read the brands on the cattle methodically, moving from animal to animal with the practiced eye of a man who had worked livestock for 20 years. He came back to where Elena was, standing with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. 3 from the Henderson spread, he said. 2 from McAllister's, and 1 from the Morrison property over the ridge. Not yours, not mine. He turned and looked at the barn, at the new wood on the door, at the wagon tracks. Someone has been using this location. Someone who knew the property was empty. Someone who knew exactly where my land boundary runs. Elena thought of Caleb Voss riding comfortably across these fields, knowing every acre, every boundary, every abandoned structure. We can't move them, she said. If we move them, we disturb the evidence. We need witnesses who aren't us. Henderson, Caleb said immediately. He's a straight man. If I send word that I've found his cattle, send Pete, Elena said, and send him now, before anyone comes back to check on them. Caleb looked at Pete, who was already straightening with the particular readiness of someone who has been waiting to be useful. Ride to Henderson's, Caleb said. Tell him Caleb Voss has found cattle on his property that he believes belong to Henderson, and he'd be grateful for Henderson to come identify them. Don't say anything else. Pete was on his horse before Caleb finished the sentence. Henderson arrived by mid-morning with 2 of his own hands and a face set hard with a rancher's fury at finding stolen livestock. He identified a short, ugly laugh. He identified his cattle without hesitation, read the other brands, and stood in the barn doorway with his arms crossed and looked at Caleb Voss with an expression that had shifted from suspicion to something more complicated. You found them, Henderson said. My wife spotted the wagon tracks yesterday, Caleb said. We rode out to look this morning. Henderson glanced at Elena, a quick reassessment. You know who ran them here? I have a strong suspicion, Caleb said carefully. I don't have proof yet. When I do, I'll bring it to the marshal. Henderson was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man. Elena could see that in the deliberate way he'd moved through the barn, in the way he listened before he spoke. The Cutter's Creek property, he said slowly. That's been empty for years. Sits right at your border. I know. Someone wanted to be able to point to it. I know that too. Henderson looked at him for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. You could have said nothing. Moved the cattle, muddied the tracks, pretended you never saw them. Caleb shook his hand. That's not how I run my operation. No, Henderson said quietly. I didn't think it was. He paused. Whatever you need from me when you're ready to take this to the marshal, I'll be there. Damien arrived the following Tuesday, looking exactly as he always did, well-dressed, easy in his manner, carrying a small crate of supplies as though he'd thoughtfully picked them up in town. Elena met him at the door. Caleb's out at the southern section, she said. Come in. I'll get coffee. Damien settled at the kitchen table with the comfortable ease of a man who considered this house partly his. He set the crate down, made a comment about the weather, asked how Elena was settling in. Better every week, she said, setting the coffee cup in front of him. Good, good. He wrapped both hands around the cup. I worry about Caleb. He pushes himself too hard. Always has, a pause perfectly timed. Has he given any more thought to the bank situation? The offer from the regional buyer is still on the table, but these things don't stay open forever. Elena sat down across from him. What offer? A slight hesitation. Slight enough that she might not have caught it if she hadn't been watching for exactly that kind of hesitation. I mentioned it to Caleb a few weeks back. A buyer interested in the property. Fair price, all things considered. He didn't mention it to me. Well, Damien smiled. Maybe he's still thinking it through. It's a big decision. It is, Elena agreed, especially since the ranch seems to be stabilizing. She watched his face as she said it. The eastern supply situation is being resolved. A few of the neighboring ranchers have expressed interest in a cooperative arrangement. Things feel more manageable than they did a month ago. Something moved behind Damien's eyes. It was very fast and very well controlled, but it was there a flicker of something that was not the concern of a man who wanted the ranch to succeed. That's good to hear, he said warmly. Isn't it? Said Elena. She went back to the accounts that afternoon with a new focus. Damien's mention of a buyer, a specific buyer, a regional buyer, an offer that was still on the table was new information. If there was already a buyer in place, then the timeline of what Damien was building was further along than she'd understood. He wasn't creating conditions for Caleb to eventually decide to sell. He was preparing for a transaction that was already arranged, which meant there was paperwork somewhere. It took her 2 days to find the thread. It came through the bank records, specifically correspondence that had been filed under a contractor's name rather than under Voss property accounts, which is exactly the kind of filing decision someone makes when they don't want the connection to be found easily. Correspondence was between the bank's regional office and a land acquisition company operating out of the Eastern Territory. The company's listed agent was a man named R. Callow. The dates of the correspondence ran back 14 months. 14 months of a buyer waiting patiently for a sale that Damien had been engineering from the inside. Elena sat with the papers in the lamplight and thought about the scope of what she was looking at. This was not impulsive. This was not a cousin who had grown greedy and made bad decisions. This was planned, constructed carefully over years, while Caleb recovered from an accident and tried to hold his ranch together. While Margaret left and the staff drifted away, and the numbers kept sliding in the wrong direction. While Damien Voss stayed, the one person who stayed. She thought about what Caleb had said that first night he was the only one who stayed, and she felt something cold and heavy settle into the pit of her stomach because the cruelest part of what Damien had done was exactly that. He'd stayed. He'd been present for the grief and the difficulty and the slow, painful rebuilding, and he'd used every piece of it, turned every vulnerability into a tool, and worn the face of family the entire time. She brought the papers to Caleb after supper. She spread them on the table and walked him through what she'd found, slowly and in order, because he deserved to understand the whole shape of it at once, rather than having pieces fed to him. She watched his face move through the information, the dates, the company name, the correspondence that proved a sale, had been arranged long before Caleb had been given any reason to consider selling. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. R. Callow, he said finally. Does the name mean anything to you? No. He picked up one of the papers and read it again, as though a second reading might change what it said. 14 months, at least. He set the paper down. He pressed one hand flat against the table. The accident, he said, and stopped. Elena waited. I've always wondered, he said, about the accident. He was speaking carefully, measuring each word. The horse, it was a horse I'd ridden for 6 years. Steady animal. Not given to shying, he paused. That day she came apart completely. Threw me in a way she'd never. He stopped again. I told myself it was bad luck. Something spooked her. It happens. The room was very quiet. You think it wasn't bad luck, Elena said. He didn't answer directly. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. I think, he said slowly, that if a man had been planning to take everything I own for over a year before the accident, then the accident becomes a different kind of question. Elena had thought this the moment she'd read the dates on the correspondence. She hadn't said it because she'd wanted him to arrive at it himself, in his own time, because a conclusion you reach yourself sits differently than one someone hands to you. We need the marshal, she said. We need more than the marshal, Caleb said. We need evidence that holds. Not ledger patterns that could be argued as incompetence. Not correspondence that a lawyer can muddy. He looked at her. We need him to show his hand. Elena thought about that. About the shape of what they knew versus what they could prove. About Damien's confidence, his belief that Caleb was too beaten down and too trusting to ever look closely enough. About the particular danger of a man who had never been questioned. Then we give him a reason to move faster, she said. What do you mean? She leaned forward. He's running a timeline. He has a buyer waiting. He needs the ranch to reach a tipping point a moment where selling feels like your only options before the buyer loses patience. She tapped the correspondence. If we create the impression that the tipping point has arrived, that you're ready to consider selling, that you're desperate enough to move quickly, he'll accelerate, Caleb said. And when he accelerates, he'll make mistakes. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't entirely read what was in his face. It was still not a face that gave up much, but there was something there that hadn't been there a month ago. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like a man who had stopped calculating alone. You're sure about this, he said. No, she said. But I think it's the best option we have. He was quiet another moment. Then he nodded once in the way he had of nodding when something was decided. All right, he said. Then we build the trap. What followed was the most careful performance of Elena's life. Over the next 2 weeks, she and Caleb constructed a version of events for Damien to find. Caleb let slip, in a conversation with a merchant in town who was known to talk, that the ranch was in worse shape than he'd been letting on. Elena mentioned to the merchant's wife, apparently in confidence, that she was worried about their future on the property. Pete was instructed. Reluctantly, he didn't like the deception, which Elena respected, to mention to another hand at a neighboring ranch that the Voss operation was looking shaky. None of it was dramatically stated. Drama would have looked engineered. This was quieter, the specific, credible language of people who are trying not to sound as worried as they are. Within a week, it had reached Damien. She knew because his next Tuesday visit was different. He arrived slightly earlier than usual. He was warmer than usual, which was its own kind of signal, because excessive warmth from Damien meant he was managing something carefully. He spent longer talking to Caleb than he normally did, and the conversation kept drifting, with Damien steering it gently toward the future of the property, toward what a man owed himself when things weren't working out, toward the particular relief of making a clean decision before circumstances forced a messier one. Caleb played it exactly as they'd rehearsed, tired, uncertain, a man whose resistance was wearing down. Damien left that afternoon with the look of a man walking toward something he'd been waiting for. Elena stood at the window and watched him go and felt the cold clarity of a plan that was working, mixed with the specific anxiety of knowing that a plan working meant the dangerous part was still ahead. She turned from the window. Caleb was sitting at the table with both hands around his coffee cup, staring at the middle distance. He bought it, she said. Yeah, Caleb said. He did. Neither of them said anything else for a minute. You all right? Elena asked. He considered the question, which she'd noticed he always did. He never answered quickly, never reflexively. No, he said finally. But I will be. He looked up at her. Are you? She thought about it. About the ranch that had become, somewhere in the past month, something she wanted to protect. About the man across the table who had started as a name on a notice board and had turned into something she didn't have a clean word for yet. About the fight that was still coming and the pieces they didn't control, and the very real possibility that this could still go wrong. Me again when it's over, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then, very quietly, something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face. Fair enough, he said. 3 days after Damien's visit, the letter arrived. came through the bank not directly to Caleb, but routed through the regional office in the way that official correspondence sometimes is when someone wants it to carry institutional weight. The letter informed Caleb Voss that his outstanding loan balance had been reviewed, that the terms of his original agreement were being reconsidered in light of the ranch's current financial position, and that a representative from the bank would be visiting within the fortnight to assess the property's value and discuss next steps. Elena read it twice, standing at the kitchen table. Then she handed it to Caleb without a word. He read it once. Set it down. They don't move this fast, he said. Banks don't move this fast unless someone pushed them. Damien has a relationship with the regional office, Elena said. I found correspondence between them going back almost 2 years. He told them I was ready to fold. I think he told them the moment was now. That waiting any longer risked the deal. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. He's accelerating, which means our window for what comes next is shorter than I'd planned. Caleb turned the letter face down on the table as though he didn't want to look at it anymore. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose board on the porch that neither of them had gotten around to fixing. It was the kind of sound that, after a month of living here, Elena had started to find almost ordinary, another small broken thing, on a ranch that had too many of them, all waiting for a moment when there was time. How short, he asked. A week, maybe 10 days if we're careful about how we play the next visit. He was quiet for a moment. And if we're not ready in 10 days? Then he files the paperwork with the bank, yen Dalsport, and we spend 6 months in a legal fight that will cost more than the ranch is worth. She said it plainly because he needed plainness, not reassurance. One of the things she had learned about Caleb Voss in the past 5 weeks was that softening hard facts did not help him. It only delayed the moment when he had to deal with them, and the delay cost him more than the fact itself would have. He looked at the letter again, face down. His hand rested flat on the table beside it. The knuckles were rough, the kind that come from years of real work, and there was a scar along the base of his thumb that she'd never asked about. What do we need? He said. We need the marshal to be ready. We need Henderson and at least one other rancher willing to stand as witnesses to the cattle situation. And we need Damien to make a move that we can document before the bank representative arrives. Provoking him means giving him something to react to. Yes. What? Elena had been thinking about this for 2 days. She'd turned it over from every angle she could find, looking for the approach that gave them the most control with the least exposure. The problem with setting a trap for a man like Damien was that he was intelligent and careful in ordinary circumstances. Panic was the only thing likely to make him careless. And the thing most likely to make him panic was the belief that someone else was about to take what he'd been building toward. We need a competing buyer, she said. Caleb frowned. A real one? No, the suggestion of one. If Damien believes another party is showing serious interest in the Voss property, someone moving faster than his arrangement with the regional buyer, he'll feel his timeline collapsing. He won't wait to see if it's real. He can't afford to. And a man who can't afford to wait makes mistakes. Exactly. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The wind rattled the porch board again. Who do we get to play the competing buyer? Elena had already thought about this too. Henderson. Henderson agreed without much persuasion, which told Elena something about the kind of man he was, and also something about how much goodwill Caleb had built over the years without seeming to realize he'd built it. They met at Henderson's property, not the Voss ranch, because meeting there risked Damien's informants in town catching wind of something, and Elena laid out the plan at Henderson's kitchen table, while Henderson's wife moved quietly in the background and pretended not to listen, which Elena suspected meant she was listening carefully. You want me to put out word that I'm interested in buying the Voss land, Henderson said. Not that you're interested, Elena said, that you've already made an offer, that it's serious, that you've engaged a lawyer to draw up preliminary terms. Henderson looked at Caleb. You comfortable with your neighbor's name being used this way? I'm comfortable with whatever gets us to the end of this with the ranch still standing, Caleb said. Henderson turned back to Elena. This gets back to Damien inside of what, 2 days? If we plant it in the right places, yes. And when Damien comes to Caleb to find out if it's true, Caleb will tell him he's still considering his options, that he hasn't made any decisions, but his manner will be different, less desperate, like a man who has a lifeline and knows it. Henderson rubbed the back of his neck. You think that's enough to make him move? I think a man who has spent 2 years building towards something and suddenly believes he's about to be beaten to it by someone else will do something he hasn't done before. She paused. He'll stop being careful. Henderson was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at his wife, who had stopped pretending not to listen, and she gave a small nod that said everything. All right, Henderson said. I'll go into town tomorrow morning. I'll make sure the right people hear the right things. The rumor moved through Black Hollow the way rumors always do in small towns, faster than anyone intends and slightly altered by each person who passes it along, which in this case worked in their favor because the alterations made it sound more concrete rather than less. By the time it reached the ears that mattered, Henderson had apparently not only made an offer but had shaken hands on a deal and was waiting only on the final survey. Damien appeared at the Voss ranch on a Thursday, not a Tuesday. He had never come on a Thursday. Elena saw him riding up the north road from the upstairs window, and the fact of a Thursday visit told her everything she needed to know about what the rumor had done to his schedule. Ups. She came downstairs at a measured pace and had the door open before he knocked, because she didn't want to give him a moment to compose himself in the waiting. His composure was intact, but it was working harder than usual. She could see it in the way he'd ridden the horse. The animal was lathered slightly, meaning he'd pushed, and in the way his first question skipped the usual pleasantries. Where's Caleb? Working the south fence. He'll be back by noon. She stepped back from the door. Come in, I'll send Pete. Damien came in. He sat. He accepted the coffee she poured without the usual comment about her hospitality. His eyes moved around the room with a sharpness he didn't bother to conceal this time. And Elena understood that the version of Damien who came on Thursdays was different from the version who came on Tuesdays. This one was less interested in the performance of warmth. I heard something in town, he said. Elena sat across from him. Oh! About Henderson making a move on this property. She let a beat pass. Not too long. I couldn't say what Mr. Henderson's intentions are. Elena. His voice dropped slightly, took on the register of a man making a direct appeal. I need you to tell me straight. Has Caleb made any agreements with Henderson? Any commitments? She looked at him steadily. Why would that be your concern? Something flickered. Because I've been looking out for this ranch for 2 years. I've put time and effort and my own credibility on the line to help Caleb through a very difficult period. If he's about to make a decision that affects everything I've worked toward, he caught himself. Recalibrated everything I've worked to help him build. Elena said nothing. She just looked at him with the polite, slightly unreadable expression she'd been cultivating for weeks, and she watched him hear his own words back and realize how they'd sounded. I just want what's best for Caleb, he said, more carefully. I know you do, she said. Caleb arrived 40 minutes later, having been sent for by Pete. He came in with mud on his boots and the particular exhaustion of a man who had been working a fence line in October wind, and he sat down across from his cousin and listened to Damien's version of the concern he'd expressed to Elena, smoother now, more composed, the language of family and loyalty and wanting to make sure the right decision was made. Caleb let him finish. Then he said, I'm still thinking. About Henderson's offer, about everything. Damien leaned forward. Caleb, the arrangement I have in place, the regional buyer, is a guaranteed transaction. Henderson is a neighbor with his own interests. Whatever he's offering, it's not as clean as what I've set up. The word set up landed in the room like a stone dropped in water. Caleb heard it. Elena heard it. And from the way Damien's jaw tightened a fraction of a second later, he heard it too. The arrangement you have in place, Caleb repeated slowly. Pause. The arrangement I've been working to arrange. On your behalf. Right, Caleb said. On my behalf. The silence that followed was the specific silence of 3 people. In a room where one of them has said too much and all of them know it and only 2 of them are pretending otherwise. Damien left an hour later. His horse's pace going down the north road was faster than it had been coming up. Elena stood at the window again, watching him go, and felt the particular alertness of someone who has set something in motion that cannot now be stopped. He'll move tonight or tomorrow, she said. The cattle, Caleb said from behind her. Or something else. Whatever he thinks will close the door fastest. She turned from the window. We need the marshal today, not tomorrow, today. Marshal Dent was a lean, deliberate man of about 55, who had the look of someone who had seen enough in his career to be difficult to surprise, but had not yet become difficult to move. He listened to everything Elena and Caleb laid out: the ledger records, the correspondence with the regional buyer, the cattle in the abandoned barn, Henderson's testimony about the supplier situation. And he asked questions that were specific and practical, the questions of a man building a case rather than evaluating a story. When they finished, he sat for a moment. "The cattle are still in the Cutter's Creek barn?" he asked. "As of 2 days ago," Caleb said. "I haven't sent anyone back to check since. I didn't want to risk anyone noticing activity near the property." "Smart." Dent tapped the table with one finger. "The correspondence, you found the letters between the bank and the acquisition company. You have those originals?" "Copies," Elena said. "I left the originals in place. I didn't want anything to look disturbed." Dent looked at her with the faint expression of someone who has just recalibrated their assessment. "You're thorough." "I've been careful," she said. "There's a difference." "Fair enough." He stood. "I'm going to need a day to get my deputy and ride out to verify the Cutter's Creek situation independently. I'll need Henderson to come in and make a formal statement. And I need both of you to stay visible and ordinary until I've had a chance to move." He looked at Caleb. "Don't do anything that signals to Damien that you've talked to me." "Understood. If he makes a move in the next 24 hours. "He will," Elena said. Dent looked at her again. "Then we'll need to be ready for what that looks like." He picked up his hat from the table. "Get word to me the moment anything changes." What changed came at 11 o'clock that night. Pete knocked on Elena's door, 2 sharp knocks, the signal they'd agreed on, and when she opened it, he was white-faced in the lamplight, his words coming out fast and slightly tangled. "Someone at the north pasture," he said. "I heard horses. More than one. Moving the cattle, not ours, I don't think. The sound's wrong for our herd, and there's a wagon. I could see the lantern." Elena was already pulling on her coat. "Did they see you?" "No, I came straight back." "How many men?" 3, maybe 4. It was dark. She went down the hall and knocked on Caleb's door. 3 knocks, and heard him moving before she finished. He opened the door, already half-dressed, and she told him, in 20 words, what Pete had told her. And she watched the thing that happened in his face, the anger. Yes, but underneath it, something harder and more focused. Expression of a man who has spent 2 years wondering when the other boot would drop, and has just heard it hit the floor. Caleb said, "Ride to Henderson's. Tell him to send someone to the marshal." "Don't go to the marshal yourself. I need you to come back here." Pete was gone before the sentence was finished. Caleb turned back to Elena. "How far is the north pasture from the Cutter's Creek property?" "Half a mile, maybe less. They're moving the cattle to a staging area. Somewhere they can be loaded and transported before morning." He pulled on his coat. "If they get those cattle out of the county tonight, the evidence disappears," Elena said. "And all we have left is ledger patterns and correspondence that Damien's lawyer will spend 6 months arguing." She was already thinking, "We can't let them finish moving the cattle. But we can't confront 4 men in the dark either." "No," Caleb agreed. He was checking the rifle that had lived by the front door since she'd arrived, a routine motion that had never carried this specific weight before. "But we can slow them down." "How?" He looked at her. "There's a creek crossing on the only wagon road between the north pasture and the county line. One crossing, no alternative route. If we block it, it buys us time," she said immediately. "How?" "There's a downed tree at the north end of the property. Old oak came down in the spring. We never cleared it, because there was always something more pressing." He set the rifle down and picked up his cane. "If we can get it across that road before they reach the crossing." "Caleb, it's a downed oak. It's on a slope," he said. "It won't take much to roll it. It just needs to be enough to stop a loaded wagon." Elena looked at him for half a second. Then she went to get her own coat. The night was cold and overcast, and the kind of dark that makes distances unreliable. They took the horses at a walk until they were well clear of the main buildings. Then, pushed to a canter, Elena slightly ahead because she'd ridden this ground more recently and knew where the rabbit holes were. Caleb rode without complaint, which she'd stopped being surprised by. His leg was worse at night. She knew that, but what she'd also come to know was that he had a very specific relationship with his own pain. He did not pretend it wasn't there. But he also refused to let it be the deciding factor in any situation where something mattered. That quality, she had thought more than once, was either admirable or stubborn, depending on the day. Tonight it was admirable. The oak was where he'd said it was, lying on a slope above the creek road, half its root system pulled from the ground, and The trunk angled in a way that suggested it had been held in place for months, mostly by its own weight, and a collection of smaller branches that had piled up against it. Caleb dismounted and assessed it the way he assessed everything, quickly, practically, already calculating. If we get the branches clear on the downhill side, the weight will do the rest. They worked in the dark, both of them pulling away the debris that had accumulated against the trunk, moving by feel as much as sight. Cold made everything harder. Elena's hands were numb within 10 minutes, and she broke 2 nails down to the quick hauling branches aside, which she noted and ignored because there was no useful response to it. Caleb worked beside her without his cane. He'd left it, with the horse moving in the careful way of a man who has learned to compensate for an unreliable leg by making sure his other points of contact with the ground are solid. He fell once, caught himself on the trunk, got back up without a word. She didn't offer her hand. She'd learned that offering help in those moments cost him something, and that the better move was to simply keep working as though she hadn't noticed, which was its own kind of consideration. When enough of the debris was cleared, Caleb braced his shoulder against the upper side of the trunk and looked at her. On 3, they pushed. The oak resisted for a long moment, long enough that Elena thought they'd miscalculated the slope, and then something gave. Some critical balance point shifted, and the trunk began to move with the particular gathering momentum of something very heavy that has found the direction it wants to go. It rolled, crashed through the remaining brush, and came to rest squarely across the creek road with the impact they felt through the ground. Elena straightened up. Her back ached. Her hands were bleeding in 2 places. "That'll do it," Caleb said. He was breathing hard, which was the only concession he made to the effort. They got back on their horses and moved to a position in the tree line above the road, where they could see that crossing without being seen. They waited in the dark and the cold, not talking, because there was nothing useful to say, and they'd both understood by now that silence between them didn't require filling. The wagon came 20 minutes later, 4 men, as Pete had said. A lantern hung at the front, and in its light, Elena could see the shapes of cattle in the wagon bed, standing uneasily, and she felt the anger move through her like something physical at the sight of them. Henderson's cattle, McAllister's cattle, stolen and loaded, and being moved in the middle of the night by men who were paid to make Caleb Voss look like a criminal. The wagon reached the crossing and stopped. She could hear the driver's voice, low and frustrated, and then the sound of boots hitting the ground as men climbed down to look at the obstacle. "We need to go," Elena said quietly. "Not yet," Caleb said. "Caleb, I want to see if Damien's with them." She looked at the group of men at the crossing, and the answer came 30 seconds later, as a 5th rider appeared from behind the wagon, moving up to the front to see what had stopped them. The lantern caught his face, Damien Voss. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be the man who set things in motion and kept his distance, the architect, not the laborer. The fact that he was here, in person, on this road in the middle of the night, told Elena something important. He was scared. The competing buyer rumor had rattled him enough that he'd come himself to make sure this final piece went through. Scared men made more mistakes than careful ones. "Now we go," Caleb said. They rode back to the ranch at a pace that made Elena's eyes water in the wind. And when they arrived, Pete was already back from Henderson's with the information that Henderson had sent his fastest rider to the marshal's office. All they could do now was wait. The wait was 40 minutes, which felt considerably longer. Marshal Dent arrived with 2 deputies and Henderson, who had come himself rather than send a man, which Elena thought said something about the kind of neighbor Henderson was. They gathered in the main house while Dent was briefed on the tree and the wagon and the 5 men at the crossing, and she watched Dent's expression go from careful to decided in the span of about 90 seconds. "How long ago?" he asked. 45 minutes, Elena said. "A loaded wagon with a cleared tree across the road. They'll still be there." Dent looked at his deputies. "Ride." He turned back to Caleb. "You and your wife stay here. That's my land, and it'll still be your land in the morning," Dent said, not unkindly. "I need a clean arrest. I don't need a rancher in the mix who has reason to make things personal." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Damien's there. Good. Then I'll have everything I need." Dent picked up his hat. "Henderson, you're with me. I need you to formally identify those cattle on site." He looked at Elena once more, the same assessing look he'd given her in the office. Good thinking with the tree. It was Caleb's idea, she said. Dent glanced between them and said nothing, but something in his expression suggested he'd taken note of the exchange. Then he was gone, his deputies already mounted, Henderson behind them. The door closed. The house was very quiet. Caleb stood in the middle of the kitchen, not moving, and she could see the effort it was taking him to not be on that road. His hands were at his sides. His jaw was still set. The cane was somewhere outside by the horses, and he was standing without it. His weight distributed in the compensating way she'd come to recognize, the way that said he was holding himself together through will, more than anything structural. He's going to try to talk his way out of it, Caleb said. Let him, Elena said. Every word he says tonight is something the marshal hears. He'll have a lawyer by morning. He'll need one. She moved toward the stove and put the kettle on, because it was 2 a.m, and they were both cold, and there was nothing else constructive to do. The correspondence we found, the cattle, Henderson's testimony, Pete's observations, Damien built something very thorough, which means there are a lot of pieces for the marshal to find. Thorough plans fall apart thoroughly, Caleb said, almost to himself. Usually. He stood for another moment. Then he pulled out the kitchen chair, not his usual chair, the one at the far end, the one that said keep a distance, but the one closer to where Elena was standing, and he sat down in it, and she turned from the stove and registered this without commenting on it. His mother and mine were sisters, Caleb said. Grew up on neighboring properties. We used to ride together when we were boys. He was funny when we were young. Quick. I always thought he was smarter than me, but I didn't mind because it seemed like something we were in together, not something he was using. Elena set 2 cups on the table. When did it change, she asked. Caleb thought about it. Gradually. So gradually I don't think there's a moment I can point to. He looked at the table. Or maybe I just didn't want to see it. That's not weakness, she said. Not seeing it. Feels like it. It feels like it because you trusted him. Trusting someone's isn't weakness. What he did with that trust, that's the failure. And it's his, not yours. He looked up at her. She was still standing, both hands around her own cup, and she met his eyes directly. The way she had learned was the only kind of eye contact that worked with him, not soft, not careful, just straight on and honest. You've said that kind of thing to me before, he said. Same idea. I'll keep saying it till it sticks, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then, for the second time since she'd come to the ranch, she saw something that might have been the beginning of a real smile, not the wry, closed-off expression he used as armor, but something that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth, something that looked involuntary and therefore real. You're a stubborn woman, Elena Whitmore, he said. Voss, she said. Then she stopped, because she hadn't planned to say it, and she wasn't sure what to do with having said it. The room was quiet for a moment. Voss, he repeated, and the word in his voice was something she didn't have a name for, but felt distinctly. The kettle began to whistle. She turned back to the stove, grateful for the reason to turn away, and poured the water, and said nothing. And neither did he, and the silence between them was not empty at all. Marshal Dent returned at 4 a.m. Came to the door alone. His deputies had stayed with the wagon and the cattle, and he looked like a man who had done something he'd been meaning to do for a while, without knowing he'd been meaning to do it. Damien Voss is in custody, he said. 4 hired men with him, 3 of whom have already decided their employment arrangement wasn't worth a prison sentence. He looked at Caleb. The cattle are all accounted for. Henderson will have his back by morning. Caleb stood in the doorway and said nothing for a moment. The barn at Cutter's Creek? Elena asked. We'll go through it at first light. Based on what your records showed, I expect we'll find more there than just tonight's animals. Dent paused. Damien asked for a lawyer, which is his right. But before the lawyer got mentioned, he said 2 things that are going to make this considerably simpler. What did he say? Caleb asked. Dent looked at him steadily. He said the ranch should have been his to begin with, and he said the accident was supposed to finish things faster. He paused, letting that land. I'll need formal statements from both of you in the morning. But I want you to know what you did tonight. The tree. The delay, that's what gave us the time to catch him with the cattle in the wagon. Without that, we'd have had correspondence and ledgers. With it, we have him in the act. He nodded once. Get some rest. He left. Caleb stood in the open doorway a moment longer, the cold air moving past him into the warm kitchen, And Elena stood a few feet behind him and looked at the back of his head and thought about what Dent had said the accident was supposed to finish things faster. And she felt the weight of it, the years of it, everything Caleb had carried, thinking it was bad luck, and it had been something else entirely. He closed the door. He turned around. His face was the still face again, but it was different now, not the stillness of a man keeping himself together, but the stillness of a man who has set something down that he's been carrying a very long time and isn't quite sure yet what his arms feel like without it. It wasn't bad luck, he said. No, Elena said quietly. It wasn't. He nodded, one small nod absorbing it. Then he pulled out the closer chair again and sat down, and Elena refilled his cup without being asked. And they sat at the kitchen table in the 4 o'clock quiet of a house that had just changed into something different than it had been the day before. And neither of them said anything for a while, and it was enough. The morning after Damien's arrest arrived the way mornings do, after nights that changed things gray and ordinary on the surface, as though the world hadn't registered what had shifted underneath it. Elena slept 3 hours and woke before the light was full. She lay still for a moment, listening to the ranch sounds she'd learned over the past 5 weeks, Pete moving in the yard, the cattle in the near pasture, the loose porch board that caught the wind from the northwest. And she thought about the formal statements they'd need to give Dent, and the bank, and what happened to a transaction when the man who had engineered it was sitting in a jail cell, and about half a dozen other practical concerns that arranged themselves in her mind in order of urgency before she'd even sat up. She was not a woman who processed difficulty by sitting with it, processed it by figuring out what needed doing next. Caleb was already in the kitchen when she came downstairs. He'd made coffee, which he sometimes did and sometimes didn't, depending on how early he'd been up. And he was sitting at the table with both hands around his cup and the ledger open in front of him. Not reading it exactly, more like looking at it. The way you look at something that has been source of dread for a long time and has now transformed into evidence. Marshall will want us by 8, Elena said. No, he looked up. There were shadows under his eyes. You sleep? She poured herself a cup and sat. You? Not much. He turned a page in the ledger without really seeing it. Kept thinking about what Dent said, what Damien said. She waited. The accident was supposed to finish things faster. He repeated it the way a person repeats something they've been turning over, wearing the edges down to see what's underneath. The horse had been shying at nothing for 2 days before it threw me. I thought she was sick. I had Pete check her feed, her shoes. He paused. If someone had gotten to her feed. Don't, Elena said. He looked at her. I don't mean don't think about it, she said. I mean don't go down the road of everything it could have been. You'll spend a year in your own head reconstructing something you can't change. She held his gaze. The marshal will investigate the accident separately. Let him do it. What we need to focus on now is what comes next. He was quiet for a moment. Not resisting, she could tell the difference by now between Caleb resistant and Caleb processing. You're right, he said finally, which cost him something. She knew, and she didn't make anything of it. The bank, she said, moving them forward. The regional representative was supposed to arrive within the fortnight. We need to get ahead of that. Dent said he'd contact them. Dent will contact them about the criminal matter. That's separate from the loan terms. We need our own communication to the bank, something that establishes clearly that the financial picture they've been receiving has been manipulated. She tapped the ledger. With these records, and with the testimony from Haskell and Henderson, we can show exactly what the accurate numbers look like, which are not good, but they're survivable. The ranch isn't failing. It was being made to look like it was failing. Caleb watched her. You've already drafted it. She hadn't quite drafted it. She'd outlined it in her head at approximately 3 in the morning. I know what it needs to say. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. Of course you do. He closed the ledger. Write it. I'll sign whatever you put in front of me. You should read it first. Elena. He said her name in a way that was becoming familiar, a specific tone that meant stop underestimating how much I trust your judgment. Write it. Dent's office was a single room attached to the jail at the far end of Black Hollow's Main Street. And it smelled like old wood and tobacco and the particular staleness of a space where difficult conversations happened regularly. The marshal sat across from them at a desk, stacked with papers, and took their statements in the methodical way of a man who had learned early that the details matter more than the summary. He spent 40 minutes with Elena going through the ledger patterns, asking her to walk him through each anomaly she'd found and when she'd found it. He was precise about dates in a way that told her he was already building the timeline for a court case. The correspondence with the acquisition company, he said. You said you found copies in the contractor files. The originals are still there. I made copies by hand and left the originals in place, so nothing would look disturbed. Dent wrote something. Good. I'll need to retrieve those today, with a witness. He looked up. The company name R. Callow, acting agent. We ran that this morning. Company is a shell, 3 layers of incorporation, but the trail ends at a property holding registered to a family name in the Eastern Territory. He paused. Voss. The room was quiet for a moment. A different branch of the family, Dent added. Not a close relation, but connected. Caleb sat very still beside Elena. He had partners. He had backers, Dent said carefully. Whether they knew the full extent of what he was doing to acquire the property, that's something the court will determine. But the money behind this arrangement went deeper than one man. He set his pen down. I want you both to understand what that means for the timeline. This won't be resolved quickly. Damien will face charges of the cattle theft. Alone is enough to hold him, and between the forged documents and the evidence of what happened to that horse, we're looking at charges that will take months to work through the court. And the ranch in the meantime? Elena asked. The ranch is yours, Dent said. He looked at Caleb. Nothing changes about your ownership. The bank transaction Damien was facilitating had no legal standing because it required your signature, which he didn't have. Acquisition company will likely back off the moment they understand the legal exposure. He paused. You're going to have to rebuild your financial picture with the bank on honest terms. That's not a small thing. But it's a different problem than the one you had yesterday. Caleb nodded slowly. One problem at a time. That's the right approach. Dent picked up his pen again. One more thing. Damien asked to speak with you this morning. The air in the room changed. No, Elena said, before Caleb could respond. Both men looked at her. Not yet, she said, modulating it slightly. She looked at Caleb. You don't have to do that today. There's nothing he can tell you today that helps anything. Caleb held her gaze. She could see him weighing it, the part of him that had grown up with Damien, that wanted that believed explanations were owed between people who had once called each other family. She understood that impulse completely and also knew it was exactly what Damien would use if given the opportunity. Tell him no, Caleb said to Dent. Dent nodded once. That's your right. Word moved through Black Hollow the way it always did, except faster than usual because the story was better than usual. By noon, the news of Damien Voss's arrest had reached every corner of the town, and by mid-afternoon it had accumulated the particular weight of a story that forces people to reconsider things they thought they understood. The reassessment of Caleb Voss happened publicly and awkwardly, the way public reassessments always do. Men who had written him off, who had accepted the gradual narrative of a rancher past his a man whose accident had broken something essential, found themselves revising without quite knowing how to account for the revision. Some of them managed it gracefully, most didn't. The merchant Greer, who had declined to extend Caleb's credit 2 months prior, and had done so with the particular confidence of a man making a sound business decision, appeared at the ranch on the second day after the arrest. He brought a tin of tobacco as though the tobacco would smooth over the credit refusal. And he stood in the yard talking to Caleb in the way men do when they want to reestablish goodwill without acknowledging they'd withdrawn it. Elena watched from the porch. Caleb handled it better than she would have. He was civil, not warm. There was a temperature he maintained, with Greer that said, I remember, but I'm not going to make this harder than it needs to be. And he accepted the tobacco without comment and sent Greer on his way, without either hostility or false friendliness. When Greer's wagon had turned back toward town, Caleb came up to the porch and stood beside her. He wants back in, he said. Of course he does. I'll let him. But not yet. He looked out toward the road. There's a sequence to rebuilding things. You don't let people back in before you've figured out which ones you actually want. Elena looked at him sideways. When did you work that out? About a week ago. He glanced at her. Someone's been teaching me to pay attention to patterns. turned back to the road so he wouldn't see that the comment had landed. Somewhere it wasn't supposed to land. The bank's regional representative arrived 4 days after the arrest, and he arrived differently than he would have. If Damien's version of events had played out cautiously, almost apologetically, with the bearing of an institution that has discovered it was being used and is now managing the liability of that discovery. His name was Alderman, and he was a compact man in his 50s with careful eyes and the practice to who negotiated difficult conversations for a living. He brought 2 colleagues, which Elena interpreted as the bank's way of making the meeting feel less like a retreat and more like a process. She and Caleb sat across from them at the kitchen table, with the ledger, the correspondence copies, and a summary document. Elena had spent 2 days preparing clear, factual, organized chronologically, kind of document that demonstrated both the manipulation that had occurred and the ranch's actual financial position. Once the manipulation was stripped away, Alderman read through it without rushing. His colleagues made notes. When he looked up, his expression was neutral in the careful way of someone who has decided what they're going to say and is measuring the delivery. This is thorough. The situation required it, Elena said. The ranch's actual income position, as you've reconstructed it here, is significantly better than what we'd been led to believe. He tapped the document. The loan terms we were considering revising, I want to be direct with you. Those revised terms were recommended to our regional office by an outside advisor. Damien Voss, Caleb said. Alderman paused for only a fraction of a second. We're reviewing the nature of that advisory relationship. I can tell you that the recommendations he made are being set aside pending that review. He looked at Caleb steadily. The existing loan terms stand. We'll need a current assessment of the property, but based on what I'm seeing here, I don't anticipate a problem. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then he had someone inside your office. I'm not able to. I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm telling you I know. Caleb's voice was even. And I'm telling you that if the bank wants to maintain a relationship with this ranch going forward, I need to know that the relationship is clean. Alderman met his gaze. The relationship will be clean, Mr. Voss. It wasn't quite an admission, but it was close enough to one that the room registered it. After Alderman and his colleagues had gone, Elena gathered the documents from the table in Zentinins and stacked them neatly and said nothing for a moment. You did well, she said finally. I almost said something I shouldn't have about 20 minutes in, Caleb said. I know, you didn't. You nudged my foot under the table. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he let out a breath that was as close to a laugh as she'd heard from him, short, genuine, released before he quite meant to, and she felt something warm move through her chest that she was getting progressively worse at attributing to anything other than what it was. The harder work began the week after. This was the part that didn't have the particular energy of crisis, no midnight rides, no confrontations, no urgent letters. This was the quieter, more exhausting work of rebuilding something that had been systematically undermined, and it turned out to be harder in its way than the crisis had been, because it required sustained effort in the absence of adrenaline. The supplier relationships had to be rebuilt one conversation at a time. Some of them came back easily. Haskell, who had felt guilty about his part in the damage and showed it by offering better terms than the original contract, which Elena spent an afternoon renegotiating carefully, because guilt-based generosity had a shelf life, and she wanted something that would hold. Others came back slowly, still uncertain, watching to see whether the Voss Ranch's revival was real or another chapter in a story that was going to end badly, regardless. Elena went to each of them, not Caleb, she had decided, needed to be seen managing the ranch, not chasing down business relationships that should have remained intact. So she went and she talked, and she laid out the facts in the clear, practical language that had gotten Haskell to tell her the truth. 6 weeks earlier, and one by one the relationships came back into something workable. Henderson was the easiest, because Henderson had never really left. He appeared at the ranch one afternoon with 2 of his hands to help repair the south fence. He didn't announce the purpose of the visit, just rode up with tools and said he had the afternoon free, which was so transparently untrue that Elena found it unexpectedly touching. She made coffee for all of them and listened to Henderson and Caleb talk over the fence line, and she heard in the conversation a quality she hadn't been around much. In the past few weeks, two men who had known each other a long time, talking the way people do when they've moved past some kind of test together. Easier than before. You should have come to me sooner, Henderson said at one point. I know, Caleb said, when Margaret left, when things started going wrong. I would have. I know, Caleb said again. I wasn't good at asking. Henderson was quiet for a moment, working a fence post. You're better at it now. Caleb looked across the field. I had help. Henderson's eyes moved briefly toward the house, where Elena had gone back inside. He said nothing, but his expression said enough. Pete turned 17 the second week of November, which Elena only knew because she'd noticed his name and birth date in the employment record and calculated it. She mentioned it to Caleb the night before, and he mentioned it to Caleb the notebook. With the expression of a man who has just realized he's been negligent about something important. I knew that, he said. Did you? I forgot, he said. This year there was a lot happening. There was, she agreed. We should do something. I made a cake this afternoon. He looked at her. When? While you were at Henderson's. She shrugged. It's not a remarkable cake. Pete seems like a person who would appreciate a not remarkable cake more than a remarkable one. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You pay attention to people. I pay attention to useful things, she said. People are usually useful things. That's a very cold way of saying something that isn't cold at all. She looked at him. He was watching her with the particular attention he sometimes gave her direct, without the usual fraction of reserve he maintained between himself and most things, and she felt the familiar awareness of being seen in a way she hadn't quite prepared for. Cake needs to be checked, she said, and went to the kitchen. They gave Pete the cake the next morning at breakfast, and he turned the color of a brick and said you didn't have to do that, in the tone of someone who very much wanted you to have done that. He ate 2 large slices and told Elena it was good, and told Caleb he appreciated it. And the breakfast had a warmth to it that Elena noted and stored away, because these were the kinds of moments that didn't announce themselves as important, but were. The first time Caleb's leg gave out in front of her completely, they were at the north fence. It wasn't dramatic. He was stepping down from the post he'd been working on, and his weight shifted wrong, and the leg simply failed to hold. And he went down on one knee with a sharp intake of breath that she heard from 6 feet away. He was up again in seconds, catching himself on the fence, turning away as though he moved off fast enough she wouldn't have seen. She'd seen. Caleb, she said, I'm fine. I know you're fine. I'm not questioning whether you're fine. He was standing with his back half turned, both hands on the fence rail, and she could see the tension across his shoulders, the particular kind that came from someone bracing against something that wasn't the physical pain. The leg is worse today, she said, matter-of-factly, the way she'd learned to deliver observations he might otherwise deflect. Is that weather-related, or did something happen? Pause. Weather, he said, always worse when it's going to rain. She walked to where he was standing and came around so she was beside him, facing the same direction he was, both of them looking at the north field. Not looking at him, not creating the pressure of being looked at. The doctor in town, she said. Dr. Marsh. I spoke with him last week about whether there were newer approaches to the kind of injury you have. His jaw tightened. Elena, he's had training in the East. He's seen techniques that weren't available 2 years ago when you were first treated. She kept her voice level. He said it might not change the outcome, but it might improve the daily function. The pain. I manage the pain. I know you do. I watch you manage it every day. She let a beat pass. You shouldn't have to manage it alone. He was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the dry grass in the north field. In the distance, the clouds that had been building all morning were finally committing to something gray and serious. Going to rain, he said finally. Yes, another silence. I'll talk to Marsh, he said. He said it the way he said things he'd decided flatly, without embellishment, as though the decision were obvious rather than the result of something hard. Not because I think it'll change much. But he stopped. But, she said. He turned and looked at her. He was close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly, because she'd forgotten again how the proximity of him worked when he was standing at full height. Because you asked. Sky opened up 30 seconds later, the way fall rains do suddenly and without further negotiation, and they both moved toward the horses with the particular unhurried hurry of people who know they're going to get wet and have accepted it. Elena was soaked through by the time she reached the saddle, And Caleb handed her his coat without a word because he'd gotten to his horse first. And she started to decline, and he gave her the look that meant the conversation was not happening. Put on the coat. They rode back to the ranch in the rain, not talking. And the rain was cold, and the coat smelled like him. And she was increasingly running out of ways to pretend that the accumulation of all these small things did not mean what it meant. Court proceedings against Damien Voss began in early December and were, as Dent had predicted, slow. Elena attended the first 2 hearings because Dent had asked her to be available as a potential witness, and she sat in the back of the county courtroom and watched Damien across the room with the careful attention she'd been giving him since the day he'd ridden onto the Voss ranch, like he owned it. He looked different in the courtroom. Not diminished. Exactly, he was too controlled for diminishment, but constrained, as though the frame of the proceedings had reduced the space in which his particular kind of intelligence could operate. His lawyer was competent, and his posture was composed, and he answered the procedural questions with the same smooth clarity he'd brought to everything else. But he looked at Elena once, across the room, and what she saw in that look was not the concern of a devoted family member or the charm of a trusted advisor. It was assessment, cold and honest, the way he'd probably never let himself look at her when he'd believed she was an obstacle he could manage. She held his gaze until he looked away. Caleb had not come to the hearings. He had made that decision clearly, and without much explanation. He had a ranch to run, and people to pay and supply, contracts to renegotiate, and the proceedings would go the way they went without him sitting in a courtroom watching. Elena had not pushed the issue because she understood that every person had a different way of processing the particular grief of being betrayed by someone they loved, and Caleb's way was to put his hands on something that could be fixed. She understood that way. She shared it, more than she generally admitted. What she had not expected was to come home from the second hearing and find that Caleb had fixed the porch board. It was the board that had been rattling since she arrived, the one on the left side, that caught the northwest wind, the one had been on the list of things to do and never quite got there. It was fixed now, flush and solid, the new nail head slightly brighter than the surrounding wood. She stood on the porch and pressed her boot against it. It didn't move. She stood there for a moment, doing nothing, feeling something she didn't have a practical explanation for. Caleb came around the side of the house with a hammer in his hand and stopped when he saw her. "Porch board," he said unnecessarily. "I can see that." He looked at her, looking at it. "It's been bothering me. It's been bothering me since week 2, she said. "I know." He set the hammer on the porch rail. "I should have fixed it sooner." She looked at him. He was looking at the board, not at her, in the way he sometimes directed things at objects, when the things were actually meant for her. "The hearing," he said. "How did it go?" The way Dent said it would. Slow and procedural. She moved to the porch rail and leaned against it. He looked at me, Damien, once. Across the room, she paused. It didn't bother me the way I thought it would. Caleb looked at her then. What did it feel like? She thought about it. Like seeing something clearly that you'd only seen at an angle before. He's not a monster. He's just a man who wanted something and decided the wanting was more important than anything else. She turned the porch rail under her hand. That's almost more unsettling than if he were a monster, because monsters are easier to file away. "He was family," Caleb said quietly. "I know. I keep trying to figure out when exactly when the person I grew up with stopped being who I thought he was." He leaned against the other side of the rail, facing her. "And I think the answer is that he was always both. The boy I knew and the man in that courtroom, I just only let myself see one of them. We see what we need to see," Elena said, "and then circumstances force us to look again." He was quiet for a moment. The late afternoon light was coming through at a low angle, the way it did in early December, and it caught the side of his face, and she thought not for the first time, and with less surprise than the previous times, that he was a man who had been worn into something more himself, by difficulty rather than less. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the arrangement." Her hands stilled on the porch rail. "The arrangement we made," he said, "when you arrived. What it was and what it's become." He was looking at the north field rather than at her, which she recognized as his way of saying something he'd rehearsed, but still found difficult. "It's not the same thing it was." "No," she said, "it isn't. I don't know how to. I'm not good at this." He turned and looked at her directly, which cost him something visible. "I don't know what you want from this. From the ranch. From," he stopped. "From any of it." She looked back at him steadily. What do you want? He held her gaze. I want you to stop thinking of this as somewhere you ended up and start thinking of it as somewhere you chose. The words landed simply and precisely, the way he said things when he'd stripped them down to what he actually meant. She was quiet for a moment. That might take some time, she said. I have time, he said. The ranch has time. A pause. If you do. She turned back to face the north field, standing beside him at the porch rail, both of them looking at the same piece of land in the low December light. The supply situation with McAllister needs to be handled before the end of the month, she said. I know, and the south pasture rotation we need to talk about spring planning. I know that too. And the east fence, the section Pete flagged last week. Elena, she stopped. That's a yes or a no, he said quietly. She looked at him sideways. He was watching her, with the patience of a man who had learned, somewhere in the last 2 months, that the right kind of waiting was not the same thing as weakness. It's a yes, she said. He didn't say anything. He didn't reach for her hand or make any of the gestures that the moment might have invited. He simply stood beside her at the railing, with his shoulder almost touching hers, and looked out at the land. And she felt in the quality of his stillness something that was not distance, but its opposite, a man fully present. Simply present, choosing not to make more noise than the moment needed. The porch board held solid under both their feet. The north field caught the last of the afternoon light and held it for a moment before letting it go. And the ranch, which had been fought for and nearly lost, and was now being rebuilt one careful piece at a time, settled into the particular quiet inside it, had finally stopped being strangers to each other. The winter came in hard that year, the way winters do on the frontier when they've decided to make a point. By the second week of December, the north pasture had frozen solid along its lower edge, and the water troughs needed breaking every morning before the cattle could drink. And the kind of cold that had settled into the region was the kind that got into the walls of even a well-built house and stayed there, regardless of how much wood you burned. Elena had grown up in a place with cold winters and believed herself prepared for cold, and she revised that belief substantially within the first 72 hours of a black hollow December. But the ranch held. That was the thing she kept coming back to in the small hours when the wind made the house creak, and she lay awake calculating what still needed doing. The ranch held. The fences were repaired. The cattle were fed. The supply lines that Damien had spent 2 years quietly severing had been reconnected, one by one, through conversations that were sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes surprisingly easy and always necessary. The bank had sent a follow-up letter, formal, measured, written in the careful language of an institution managing its own embarrassment, confirming that the existing loan terms remained in place, and that a revised payment schedule, more accurately reflecting the ranch's actual position, had been arranged. It was not a perfect letter. It did not quite apologize, but it was enough. Elena read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and set it down and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, not relief exactly, which was too thin a word for it, but something closer to the particular solidity of standing on ground that has stopped shifting under your feet. Caleb read it after her. He set it down in the same spot she had. He looked at it for a moment. We're going to be all right, he said. Not a question, not a celebration. Just a man saying a true thing out loud for the first time in a while, checking to make sure it was still true when spoken. Yes, Elena said. We are, Doctor. Marsh came to the ranch on a Thursday in the second week of December, which Caleb had arranged himself without telling Elena until the morning of, which she interpreted correctly as him not wanting to give himself time to change his mind. She stayed out of it. She made herself scarce in the way she'd learned was sometimes the most useful thing she could do for him. Present enough that he knew she was there. Absent enough that he had room to handle something without an audience. Marsh was there for 2 hours. Elena heard their voices through the wall of the back room. Not the words, but the rhythm of them. Marsh's, measured and explanatory. Caleb's shorter, asking questions, she could tell, were specific and practical, rather than resistant. When Marsh left, he nodded to Elena in the expression of a doctor who has had a better appointment than he expected. Caleb came into the kitchen after and sat down and said nothing for a moment. Well, Elena said, he thinks there's nerve damage that wasn't addressed properly at the time of the original injury. He said it in the flat tone he used for information he was still organizing. something that could be treated. Not fixed, he was clear about not fixed. But better. Better is a lot. He wants me to come to town 3 times a week for a month. Some kind of treatment he trained for in Philadelphia. He looked at his hands on the table. It's going to take time away from the ranch. I can manage the ranch. I know you can. He looked up. That's not what I was. He stopped. It's not about the ranch. She waited. It's about I spent 2 years telling myself the leg was just the leg. That managing it was enough. That asking for more than managing was expecting too much. He turned his hands over on the table, looking at the scars on his palms from 30 years of ranch work. Marsh said something. He said the reason it's gotten worse, rather than staying the same, is because I've been compensating so hard that I've been causing secondary damage. That trying to manage alone was making it worse. Elena said nothing. She let the sentence sit. I know you're not going to say I told you so, he said. I wasn't going to, she said. But you could. I could, she agreed. I'd rather just see you go to the appointments. He looked at her. The winter light through the kitchen window was thin and it caught his face at an angle that showed everything, the tiredness, the 2 years of managed difficulty, and underneath it, something that had been there for a while now and was becoming less and less covered over. You're staying, he said. It was not quite a question. I'm staying, she said. Not a question at all. Christmas at the Voss Ranch was not a planned thing. It assembled itself out of small decisions that none of them quite acknowledged were building towards something. Pete found a tree, a scraggly one, genuinely unimpressive, the kind that gets left on the lot because no one wants it, and dragged it into the main house with the particular determination of a 17-year-old who has decided a thing is going to happen. Elena found a box of decorations in the back of a storage closet, dusty and half the items broken, and she and Pete spent an evening sorting through them at the kitchen table while Caleb sat nearby, pretending to work on the account books and occasionally making observations about the decorations that were drier than they were. Funny, but were closer to funny than he usually managed. Henderson and his wife came for dinner on Christmas Eve, and Henderson's wife, whose name was Clara and who turned out to be both more perceptive and more direct than her quiet, observing manner had initially suggested, sat next to Elena after supper and said without preamble, "You're good for him." Elena looked at her. "Caleb? He was disappearing," Clara said simply, "before you arrived. Not in any dramatic way that's not Caleb's style, but a little more each month, a little further inside himself." Henderson noticed. "We talked about it." She paused. "He's not disappearing anymore." Elena considered her response carefully. "He did most of that himself. He needed a reason to," Clara said. It was the kind of observation that Elena didn't know how to answer without saying more than she was ready to say, so she said nothing. And Clara, who understood people, moved the conversation to the supply situation with the grace of a woman who had made her point and didn't need to stand on it. Walking back to the main house after Henderson and Clara had gone, Caleb said, "What did Clara say to you?" "Things," Elena said. "Helpful things or uncomfortable things?" "Both." He was quiet for a moment. Their breath made small clouds in the cold night air. "She means well. I know. She's right, most of what she said." Elena paused. "She said you were disappearing before I arrived." He didn't answer immediately. The snow that had fallen earlier in the week had crusted over, and it crunched under their boots in the quiet. "I was," he said finally. "I didn't have a name for it. But I was. What stopped it?" He glanced at her sideways. "You know what stopped it. I want to hear you say it." Pause. "You stopped it." "No," she said. "You stopped it. I just gave you something worth stopping for." He was quiet again. "Then, that's a fine distinction. It's an important distinction." She meant it, and she could tell by the way he turned it over that he was taking it seriously rather than deflecting it. The difference between someone saving you and someone making it worth the effort of saving yourself that matters. You did the work, Caleb. The leg appointments, the accounts, rebuilding the supplier relationships. I watched you do all of it. I helped where I could, but the doing was yours. You held the ledger up to the light so I could see what is in it. And then you decided what to do about what was in it. He stopped walking. She stopped a step later and turned. He was standing in the snow with his hands in his coat pockets and looking at her with the direct, unguarded attention he'd been giving her more often, lately less defended, less calculated, just honest. "Why does it matter to you," he said, "that I understand it that way?" Thought about it. The honest answer, the one she'd been working toward for weeks without quite naming it. Because I came here with nothing, she said. And what I found here, the work, the purpose, the sense that I was doing something that mattered, I need to know that I built that. Not that someone gave it to me. She held his gaze. I need you to understand that you built your own recovery. And I need you to let me believe I built my own place here. Because if it's just rescue on either side, it's not rescue, he said quietly. Then we need to both keep knowing that. He pulled one hand out of his pocket and reached across the cold air between them, and took her hand not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, just the straightforward gesture of a man who had decided the distance was no longer necessary and held it, and she felt the roughness of his palm against hers, the weight and warmth of it, and they stood in the crusted snow in the cold December night, and let the simplicity of it be enough. Come inside, he said. It's freezing. Yes, she said. They went inside. January arrived, and the court proceedings continued their slow grind. Dent kept them informed through brief visits and occasional letters that summarized the developments in the economical language of a man who knew how to give people what they needed to know without burdening them with what they didn't. Damien's lawyer was good. Elena had expected that. A man who had planned as carefully as Damien had would have made provision for legal defense, and the provision was competent. The lawyer raised procedural challenges, contested the admissibility of certain records, spent considerable effort arguing that the ledger patterns could be attributed to poor management rather than deliberate manipulation. But the cattle were harder to argue. 3 ranchers identifying their own stolen animals in a wagon on a road in the middle of the night, with Damien Voss present in person, was not a pattern that bent well under legal pressure. In Damien's own words on the night of the arrest, it was supposed to finish things faster had been witnessed by Dent's 2 deputies and were not going away, regardless of what the lawyer argued about context. The additional evidence from the Cutter's Creek barn settled it. Dent had gone through the barn methodically in the days following the arrest and found records that Damien had apparently believed were secure in their obscurity, a hidden compartment in the barn's west wall, containing documentation of the cattle operation going back 14 months. Names, dates, transaction records. The kind of thing a careful man keeps because careful men don't like loose ends, and which became the thing that undid him because he'd calculated wrong about whether it would ever be found. Elena heard about the barn records from Dent on a gray January afternoon, and felt something settle in her chest that had been slightly unsettled since the night of the arrest. The question she hadn't been able to stop circling, whether what they had would be enough, had an answer now. It was enough, she told Caleb that evening. He was in the near pasture, checking on a heifer that had been off her feed, and she walked out to him through the cold and told him what Dent had said, and he stood with his hand on the animal's flank and listened and then was quiet for a moment. The compartment in the barn, he said. Yes. He built that, Caleb said slowly. He built a hidden compartment in an abandoned barn on the edge of my land. At some point sometime in the last 2 years, he rode out to that barn and built something designed to be hidden, and never. He stopped. Never mentioned it. Never showed any sign. No. He turned that over. She could see him doing it the particular way he processed things that were hard, not quickly, not with visible emotion, but with a thoroughness that meant by the time he arrived at, whatever he arrived at, he'd really arrived. He was 2 people, Caleb said finally, the whole time, and I only ever knew one of them. Most people who do this kind of thing are, Elena said. It's not a comfort, I know. But it means the person you knew, the cousin you grew up with, was real. He just wasn't the whole story. Caleb looked at her. How do you carry that? Both things being true? You just do, she said. It doesn't resolve into something cleaner. You just learn to hold both of it, without letting the second part erase the first, or the first part excuse the second. He held her gaze for a moment. You've carried things like that before. Thomas, she said simply, my husband. He was not the man I thought I was marrying. But he was also not nothing. Both things were true. She paused. The people who did what they did after he died his brothers, they thought they were making it simple for me by making Thomas simple. Just a mistake. Just bad judgment. But it wasn't simple. It was complicated, and complicated things take longer to carry, but they're more honest. The heifer shifted under Caleb's hand, and he steadied her absently, the way a man does when animals are second nature. You've never talked much about Thomas, he said. There's not much to say that I haven't said. She looked across the winter field. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't what his family made him out to be. But he wasn't honest with me about what he was walking into financially, and he wasn't strong enough to face it. And when he was gone, all of that became my problem to solve. She paused. I'm not angry at him anymore. I was. Now I understand him better than I did when I was living with him, which is one of the stranger things grief does. Caleb was quiet. I don't say that to be sad, she said. I say it because I know what it is to find out that someone you trusted was something other than what you thought. And I came through it. She looked at him directly. You'll come through this. I know, he said, because I did once before, and I didn't have half as much to hold on to. The winter evening was settling around them, the light going thin and blue, and she felt the warmth of what he meant, even though it was said plainly the way he said everything. The verdict came down on a Thursday in late February. Dent sent word in the morning, a short note delivered by his deputy. And Elena read it at the kitchen table and then sat for a moment with the paper in her hands. Caleb came in from the morning rounds and saw her face. What? She handed him the note. He read it. Damien Voss, convicted on 4 counts of cattle theft, 2 counts of fraud, and 1 count of criminal conspiracy in relation to the arranged land acquisition. Sentencing in 2 weeks. Dent's assessment, conveyed in the margins in his own handwriting, was 7 to 10 years. Caleb set the note down. He went to the window and stood there for a long moment, looking at the yard. The fence line, the land beyond it. Elena stayed where she was and let him have the space of it. She had thought, sometimes, about what this moment would feel like. She'd imagined relief or satisfaction, or possibly something more complicated. What she actually felt was a kind of quiet that was different from absence, not the quiet of nothing happening, but the quiet of something being over. Particular silence that arrives when you've been bracing for a long time and the thing you were bracing for has passed. Caleb turned from the window. His face was the still face again, but she could read it now in ways she hadn't been able to 2 months ago. Underneath the stillness, there was grief, not shock, not anger, just grief. Clean and honest, the kind that comes when something is finally finished and you have to accept that finished is what it is. He'll appeal, Caleb said. Probably, she said, won't change the outcome. No, Dent doesn't think so. He came back to the table and sat down. Not at the far end had not been his regular seat for over a month now, and she had never commented on the migration, and never would. He sat across from her and put both hands on the table and looked at the note. I need to write to his mother, he said. Elena hadn't thought about that. She thought about it now. Yes, she's in her 70s. She's not well. He paused. She had nothing to do with any of this. She won't understand how it happened, do you? He looked up. No, I understand what he did. I understand what he wanted. I don't understand how a person decides that wanting something is more important than everything else. He shook his head slightly. I never got there. Even at my lowest, I never looked at someone's life and thought taking it was something I had a right to. That's because you're not that person, Elena said. And there's no satisfying explanation for why he is. Some people just are. It doesn't comfort me. It's not supposed to. Just the truth. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the table and picked up the note and folded it precisely in thirds and held it. I'm going to burn this, he said, after I write to Irene. All right. And then I want to talk about the spring rotation. He set the folded note down. And the McAllister contract. And whether we have enough in the repair budget for the barn roof, because Pete says there are 3 places that won't hold through a wet spring. She looked at him. He looked back. Yes, she said. Let's talk about the spring rotation. March arrived the way it tends to on the frontier, not gently, not as a promise, but as a negotiation between winter and something warmer, ground that wasn't sure yet what it wanted to be. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, then the flat sections near the main buildings, leaving behind mud, and the beginning of something green so pale it was almost gray. Elena stood at the fence of the east pasture one morning in early March and watched the Voss cattle move through the thawed section toward the first new grass, and she thought about the November morning she'd arrived. At this property, the sagging porch, the boarded windows, the 16-year-old hand who'd made her wait in the cold and tried to measure the distance between that morning and this one. The distance was not simple. It was not the distance of a problem solved or a story concluded. It was the distance of a life, which is always messier and more specific than a story. The 2 broken nails she'd lost, pulling brush off a downed oak in the dark, the ledger numbers she still saw. Sometimes when she closed her eyes, the way Caleb's voice sounded, when he talked to the cattle versus when he talked to people, the 42 cents she'd arrived with, and the account book she now maintained with numbers that, while not comfortable, were honest and holding. Pete appeared beside her at the fence. He'd grown an inch since November, which she'd noticed without mentioning because mentioning it seemed like the kind of thing that would embarrass him. East section's looking better, he said. It is, Mr. Voss said. If the weather holds, we might move the second herd out up by the end of the month. We might. She watched the cattle for a moment. Pete, have you thought about what comes after here? When you're older. He considered the question. With the seriousness, he gave everything. I thought I might want my own spread someday. Nothing like this. Smaller. He paused. Is that a stupid thing to want? No, she said. It's a good thing to want. A specific thing. Those are the best kind. He was quiet for a moment. Did you want this? This specifically? She looked at the east pasture, at the pale March grass, at the cattle moving steadily through the cold morning. I wanted to stop running, she said. I didn't know what standing still would look like until I was already here. He nodded, absorbing that. The barn roof, she said. You flagged 3 places in your report. Are there more? Maybe one more. On the north corner. I wasn't sure. Show me after breakfast. He nodded and went back toward the house, and she stayed at the fence a little longer, doing something she rarely let herself do, nothing at all, simply standing in a place and letting it be the place it was. Caleb came back from his last appointment with Dr. Marsh on a Friday in mid-March, and Elena heard his horse come into the yard and heard the particular rhythm of his dismount. She could track his pain level from the sound of it now, which was a specific and private form of attention she'd never spoken aloud. And this time the dismount sounded different, not without difficulty. She wasn't going to believe in miracles, but different. He came into the kitchen, and she looked at him from across the room, and he met her eyes, and something in his expression was new, not dramatic, not transformed. Just a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying for 2 years and was still adjusting to the difference in his own weight. Last appointment, he said. How is it? He thought about it. Marsh says 30% better function over the next 6 months if I keep doing the exercises. He was careful to say 30% better, not fixed. 30% is a lot. It's a lot, he agreed. He sat down in his regular chair, the one that had migrated to the closer end of the table months ago, and looked out the window for a moment. I rode back through the north section, he said. Took the long way. Deliberately? Deliberately. He paused. The pasture up there, the section Damien had been using the Cutter's Creek barn to stage the stolen cattle near. I haven't ridden through it since the night of the arrest. She set down the work she was doing and gave him her full attention. It just looks like land, he said. That's the thing. It's not different. It's just the north pasture, same as it's been for 30 years. He looked at her. I expected it to feel like something. But it just looked like land. That's good, she said. I think so. He turned the thought over. I think what I expected was for it to look ruined, and it doesn't. Because the land isn't what was ruined. The land was just used. It's not the same thing. She looked at him. He was working something out. She could see the effort of it, the careful way he moved through what he was trying to say, not reaching for more words than he needed. What was ruined, he said slowly, was the part of me that trusted without thinking about it, the part that assumed family meant safety. He paused. And I don't think that part is coming back. Not the way it was. No, she said, it probably isn't, but I don't think it needs to. He looked at her directly. I think what's there instead, what's been there for the last few months, is better. Because it's based on something I actually know, not something I assumed. Elena held his gaze. She understood exactly what he was saying, and she understood that he was saying it to her specifically, not as a statement about the world, but as a statement about them. What do you actually know? She said. I know you, he said simply. Not perfectly, not all of it, but what I know because I've been paying attention, not because I assumed. He held her gaze. That's different from anything I've had before. She was quiet for a moment. The March morning moved outside the window, a crow somewhere, the sound of Pete in the yard, the distant cattle. I know you too, she said, in the same way. Good, he said, and the word carried everything he meant by it, no excess, no decoration, just the specific weight of a man who meant what he said and had learned to say it clearly. The ranch roof was repaired in the last week of March, all 4 problem sections that Pete had identified, plus 2 more that emerged once they were actually up there looking. It took 3 days and cost slightly more than the repair budget could easily accommodate. But Elena had found a contingency in the accounts, and Caleb had agreed to it without the kind of extended deliberation that a month ago would have accompanied any expense that wasn't strictly necessary. That was the thing about watching someone come back to themselves. It wasn't one moment. It was 100 small ones. The way he walked the ranch now, without the particular tension of a man monitoring his own limitations in public. The way he talked to the suppliers who came to renegotiate, direct and clear, not the overcautious uncertainty of a man who didn't trust his own standing. The way he'd started making plans that extended past the immediate season, talking about next year's cattle list rotation, about a section of the South Field that could be improved with work, about possibilities. People who have been surviving don't make plans. They manage. The shift from managing to planning was not something Elena could have precisely dated, but she knew it had happened, and she knew she'd been watching for it, and she felt, when she recognized it, something that was not quite pride, but was close to pride's better cousin, the satisfaction of being present for something real. The town's reassessment of Caleb Voss completed itself over the spring months in the unannounced way communities absorb new information not through any declaration, but through the accumulation of small behaviors. The way men at the feed store addressed him now. The way Greer had quietly extended the credit he'd refused in October, phrasing the offer in a way that didn't require either of them to reference the refusal. The way Henderson had begun consulting Caleb on questions about the eastern grazing land, which was Henderson's own land and Henderson's own business, and which he had no practical reason to consult about unless what he actually wanted was Caleb's opinion. Elena watched all of this from the particular vantage point of someone who had arrived with no stake in the community's judgment and had gradually acquired one. She was not invisible anymore in town. She was the wife at the Voss Ranch, the woman who had come in the arrangement and stayed, who managed the books and negotiated with suppliers and had apparently played some role in the business with Damien, the details of which had filtered through Black Hollow in the semi-accurate way details do. The women in town were polite in the various ways that a polite can mean. Clara Henderson was genuinely warm. A few others were curious in ways that felt like calculation trying to establish where Elena fit in the existing social structure. And 1 or 2 were the particular variety of cool that told her they had thoughts about a woman who had married a man under a practical arrangement and stayed when it became something else, and had opinions about the arrangement that Elena had no interest in addressing. She didn't try to manage any of it. She was there. She was present. She did what she did, and she let the town make of it what it would. She'd learned Thomas had taught her this, if nothing else, that you cannot manage how people interpret your life from the outside. You can only make sure you know the truth of it yourself. The truth of her life from the inside was this: she had arrived with nothing and had built something. Not alone she was clear about not alone, with the same clarity she'd tried to give Caleb about his own recovery, but built, genuinely, through work and attention, and the particular willingness to stay in a difficult place until it became something other than difficult. That was not a small thing. She'd understood it abstractly before. She understood it in her body now, the way you understand things that are truly yours. On an evening in late April, when the light lasted long enough again to sit on the porch after supper, Elena and Caleb sat in the 2 chairs, hers with the repaired arm that Pete had fixed in February without being asked, his with the smooth-worn wood from years of evening use, and the north field was green enough to look like itself again. They had been talking about the McAllister contract, which had finally been signed in satisfactory terms, after 3 months of negotiation, and the conversation had drifted in the way. Conversations drift in the evening, moving from practical things toward quieter ones. "Do you miss it?" Caleb said. Before what? Before here. Your life before you came. She thought about it honestly, because he asked questions that deserved honest answers, and he could tell the difference. "I miss some things," she said. "I miss the way certain things smelled in the house I grew up in. I miss one friend I had in Denton who I've lost track of." She paused. "I don't miss the life I had when I arrived here." the uncertainty, the feeling of being disposable. Like I could be moved past by someone else's decisions without any say. You have a say here, he said. I know, in all of it. He looked at her sideways. Counts. The decisions, the things we do next. He paused. I want to be clear about that. It's not generosity. It's that the ranch is better when we're making those decisions together, and I know it. She looked at him. You're very deliberate about making sure I know the practical reasons for things. Is that wrong? No. She smiled slightly. It's very you. He looked at the north field. I learned something from Damien, ironically. He used gratitude as a lever. He made people feel that help came with an implicit obligation. I don't want to be that. He paused. I want to be clear about what I'm offering and why, so you can make real choices about it rather than feeling obligated. She looked at him for a long moment. He was still watching the field, his profile against the evening light, the jaw she'd stopped finding intimidating months ago and now found simply familiar. Caleb, she said. He looked at her. I'm not here because I feel obligated, she said. I'm not here because I ran out of other options. I had other options by February. I'm here because I want to be here, because this is mine. She held his gaze. You don't need to keep making sure I know the practical reasons. I know why I'm staying. He was quiet for a moment. The evening held steady around them, the particular quality of late April on the frontier, not warm yet, not cold anymore, the world in between, and doing something careful with the light. She considered pretending she hadn't understood the question. She decided not to. Because you're someone worth staying for, she said. And because this place is worth staying for. And because who I am here is someone I recognize. Someone I didn't always have access to. She looked at the field. Thomas didn't need what I could actually do. He needed someone who made things look fine from the outside. You need what I can actually do. That's a different kind of partnership. It is, he said quietly. And you've never once made me feel like needing help was a failing, she said. Even while you were struggling with it yourself. You've been easier on me about it than you've been on yourself. He turned that over. You've been easier on me too. About the same thing. I know. I think that's what it looks like when it works. She paused. Two people being easier on each other than they'd be on themselves. He reached across the gap between the chairs and took her hand, the same way he had in December, in the snow, straightforward. Without ceremony, the gesture of a man who had decided something and acted on it. I'm going to keep doing that, he said, being easier on you than you'd be on yourself. Good, she said. I'm going to keep doing it too. They sat like that as the evening settled fully in, the north field going soft in the fading light, the cattle visible as dark shapes against the green, the ranch repaired and reorganized and alive, in ways it hadn't been a season ago, holding steady around them. There were still things unresolved. The appeal from Damien's lawyers was pending. The Southfield improvement was a 2-tier project at minimum. Caleb's leg was better but not fixed, and there would be bad days when the weather changed and the nerve damage did what it did, and they would manage those days as they came. Pete would grow up and want his own land eventually, and there would be the difficulty of replacing him. The bank relationship was workable, but required careful maintenance. The McAllister contract had a clause in it that Elena intended to renegotiate before renewal. These were not resolutions. They were the actual texture of a life, the ongoing, imperfect, necessary work of maintaining something worth maintaining. But underneath all of it, something had settled that had not been settled before. Not the settlement of a story that had been tied up, but the settlement of ground that had been tested and had held. Two people who had each arrived at themselves through loss and difficulty, and had found, in the work of this hard place, something that was genuinely theirs. Elena had come to Black Hollow with 42 cents, and a bruise on her jaw, and the understanding that survival required motion. Keep moving. Find the next thing. Don't stop long enough to feel how tired you are. What she had learned in the long work of this ranch and this man and this life she hadn't planned was something different. That the bravest thing is not always to keep moving. Sometimes the bravest thing is to stay. To plant your feet in a piece of ground and say, this is mine. This is real. This is worth the difficulty. People talk about starting over as though a clean slate is what survivors need. As though the goal is to get back to before the loss, before the betrayal, before the thing that broke what you had. But Elena had not gotten back to before. She had gotten somewhere she had never been. Place she recognized, not because she'd been there, but because she had built it herself, out of the same materials the difficulty had left her with. That was the thing no one told you about coming through the worst of it. You don't return to yourself. You arrive somewhere further along. Someone who knows things the earlier version of you couldn't have understood. Someone who has learned that needing is not weakness, and that staying is not giving up, and that the people worth having in your life are the ones who ask you what you can actually do and then trust you to do it. Caleb Voss had been a name on a notice board and had become the man beside her on this porch. And the distance between those two things was not a story of rescue. It was a story of two people who had each been through the kind of damage that teaches you what holds and what doesn't, and who had found, in the daily work of this difficult place, that they held. The porch board was solid under their feet. The north field was green in the last of the light, and the ranch that had almost been taken held steady, as it would tomorrow, and the day after that, carrying forward the particular weight of everything it had survived.